Hi folks, FluentPilot here, and welcome to the next video. Here is episode 2 of the vocabulary building series, and this time I suggest we talk about interactions in aviation context. So let's roll. Okay, so interactions. A great number of questions that we have to deal with at an English proficiency test is about interactions. That is how we communicate with each other as aviation professionals, or interact with equipment, or get involved into various situations. Hardly anyone would argue that the importance of proper communication in aviation is paramount, as it directly affects safety, or as technologies advance, interactions between pilots and aircraft systems are becoming more complex. To get hold of this huge topic, let's go ahead and split it into several subdomains, and then talk in more detail about pilot-to-controller communication, interactions between aviation personnel, between crew and passengers, about getting involved into various abnormal situations, and also inside cockpit interactions, like pilot-to-cockpit automation and pilot-to-pilot communication. Okay, number 1, communications between pilot and traffic controller. Obviously, it's about maintaining the radio or radar contact in general and transmitting information or instructions in particular. For example, the traffic controller transmitted updated weather information and alerted pilots about developing thunderstorms in the area. There is a whole lot of verbs that we can use to describe this transfer of information, like to convey or to pass, as in, the flight crew failed to convey critical information about their fuel status to the controller, or the controller passed traffic information to the aircraft. However, probably the most common verbs to use in this context are to report or to advise, with its variations like to provide advisory information, to be advised, or to be informed. For example, the crew reported they were unable to comply with altitude restrictions of the next waypoint, or the traffic controller advised the pilots that the automated terminal information service wasn't serviceable. Then we request or simply ask for something like assistance or clarification, and respond to controller's requests. The crew requested extra track miles to lose altitude before they could commence their final approach. We receive information or instructions and acknowledge or confirm the receipt, or read back the instructions. Pilots should acknowledge the receipt of all clearances and instructions directed to them, including frequency changes, or the traffic controller confirmed the emergency services were standing by. As for the controller's actions, we commonly use to assign or to instruct. The aircraft was assigned to decelerate to the minimum approach speed in order to keep the required separation from the traffic ahead, or the controller instructed them to turn 30 degrees left immediately to avoid a traffic conflict. Also, to vector, to direct, to guide, or suggest may be helpful here. Finally, you might want to use to clear or to issue a clearance, and to cancel clearance, as in, they were cleared to follow the arrival route as published, but then the controller canceled all altitude and speed restrictions. It would be great if we ran through a few adjectives too, right? Like for example, the communication we are talking about is expected to be clear and concise. Instructions may be ample, insufficient, or ambiguous, controversial, inappropriate, inconsistent, or say inaudible or indistinct. Needless to say, they should be in compliance with standard phraseology, or pilots should use, or should stick to, or should adhere to standard phraseology. Let's take a look at more examples. A part of the controller's message was muffled and indistinct, or ambiguous and non-standard phraseology is a common contributing factor to incidents and accidents. It's quite common that you might be prompted to talk about the challenges to communication between pilots and controllers. For example, due to radio connection problems or misunderstanding in general. As for the former, We use to be impaired to describe low quality connection, or to be unreadable, or to be garbled with regard to a message or an ATC instruction, meaning the transmission was distorted or unclear. Keep in mind a few particular issues that you need to be familiar with when talking about radio connection problems, like clipping, overlapping, interference, or frequency congestion. For instance, the signal strength was seriously impaired by radio frequency interference. Now, misunderstanding is a big and popular interview topic itself, and we will not be diving too deep into it right now. However, let's name a few cool verbs that may get handy. Everything with prefix mis is good, like to mishear, to misinterpret, to mislead, to get mistaken, or just to miss. Good options also are to confuse and to overlook, or maybe even to ignore. The crew seemed to have ignored the control's instructions, or the pilots confused the call sign and picked up an instruction that had been issued for another aircraft. Now, moving on to interactions among aviation personnel. We come across this topic when we are asked to talk on how pilots interact with the ground handling team, cabin crew, maintenance engineers, ramp agents, dispatch officers, and others, or when there is a need to talk about these jobs in particular, or about the importance of effective communication among employees. I guess the core idea here is to be able to say that we all need to cooperate or collaborate in the most efficient manner. Because, for instance, improper communication between pilots and maintenance personnel has both commercial implications for the company and poses a threat to flight safety. If you are ready for the next level vocab, you might use something like to liaise in this context, as the job of a flight operations officer suggests that you liaise with staff airside, around the aircraft, and elsewhere on the ramp. As for flight-to-cabin crew interactions, let's point out some relevant verbs like to brief, to keep updated, to keep informed, to keep in the loop, also to exchange information, and perhaps to coordinate actions. For instance, an effective briefing is a valuable tool for cabin crew and flight crew to help manage errors. A good portion of interview questions is about being a team player, or promoting teamwork, or demonstrating or exercising a good CRM. Cabin crew should be encouraged to use CRM as part of their work practice. Now, interaction between pilots and passengers is pretty much limited to addressing over the PA system, or greeting them, or saying goodbye, or making a casual announcement. This whole thing about briefing and keeping them updated and informed on the course of the flight, and especially on any possible changes to the flight plan, also works perfectly well here. It's important to keep the passengers informed regarding the state of the flight and the estimated time of arrival. Sometimes with the reference to disruptive behavior, you might need to talk about the crew trying to calm the passengers down, or to persuade or convince those unruly passengers to do something. As in, the captain made an announcement trying to persuade the unruly passengers to come down and get back to their seats. But after a while, the bullies got up again and attempted to enter the cockpit. We will be getting to disruptive behavior on board the plane in later episodes within the abnormal domain, I think, so stick around. Now let's get back to the cabin crew. They interact with passengers in many more ways. They obviously show them to their seats, serve meals and refreshments, demonstrate emergency equipment, they conduct, coordinate, or ensure safety procedures in case of an emergency, and render or administer or provide first aid in case of an in-flight medical emergency. Okay, now let's move on to the subdomain that covers involvement with various abnormal situations. Particularly, you might be offered to talk on how pilots and controllers respond or react to these kind of events. Take a note of powerful verbs like to face a problem, or encounter a problem, or experience, or confront, or to get into, or to run into, or to come across a situation. For example, during the sim session, pilots were confronted with multiple failures and were asked to identify the primary faults. Or, according to the incident report, the pilots ran into problems shortly after takeoff. If smart enough, we expect an unpleasant situation to come, or we foresee it, we anticipate it, or see it coming. A cliche thing to say that when pilots are able to do that, it means that they're flying ahead of the airplane. Or you may simply use to be prepared, to stay alert, to stay vigilant for possible dangers and difficulties, as opposed to staying negligent or inattentive. For instance, pilots need to stay vigilant for a wide range of data from all kinds of aircraft systems. Or traffic controllers are recommended to give clearances in good time, anticipating, if possible, periods of high pilot workload. When we get into a situation, we deal with it. We handle it or tackle it. Good alternatives here are to cope with the problem, to sort it out, and also a cool one, to get to grips with the problem. For instance, the pilots had to deal with multiple failures. Or, due to increased traffic, the airport was not able to handle all arrivals, so the controls were placing airplanes into holding patterns. Finally, let's cover the inside cockpit interactions. Specifically, what verbs we commonly use to describe how pilots interact with the cockpit automation. They apparently control the systems, monitor instruments and displays, and ensure their correct operation. They manage the systems in general and configure them or reconfigure them. They focus their attention on something, or, on the contrary, evenly distribute attention. The navigation display of the first officer was configured to show indications from one of the VOR receivers, or the autopilot is used to control basic aircraft movement, while the pilot focuses attention on tasks such as reviewing charts, configuring for an instrument approach, or updating weather information. Or the auto-flight system got partially disabled and could not control power settings, so the pilot had to manage the throttle manually. Pilots take over, override, or overpower if correct operation of automatic system is in doubt. They gain or regain control, for instance, after an excessive deviation from a flight path, or after an altitude loss. For example, following the checklist seemed to allow the pilots to regain control of the aircraft. Or, the design of the autopilot did not allow the pilots to override it by use of opposing control stick pressure. Or, the first officer failed to take over the controls after having asked for a go-round 3 times. Operation modes are usually selected, or engaged, or armed, whereas various parameters like speed and altitude may be adjusted. Let's add a couple more verbs like to input data, or to make or provide inputs into the FMC, or load navigation computer. For example, after providing inputs to the automated systems, the pilot then monitors system's performance and ensures the system is running as expected. Finally, pilot-to-pilot interactions. A common thread for discussion here is how the tasks are distributed among pilots, or how they share the workload or share the duties, how they alternate or switch roles of pilot flying and pilot monitoring, and also how they prioritize tasks in case of an abnormal situation. Let's also add simple yet important checking and cross-checking each other's actions, assessing risks, and making a decision. Again, the CRM vocab we talked about earlier will work here fine, and I would also add the issues of distracting attention to this subdomain and maintaining a sterile cockpit too. Flight attendants are trained not to contact the cockpit during sterile cockpit procedures, or pilots did their best in managing crew resources and working as a team. This allowed them to maintain accurate situation awareness and properly assess the risks. A bunch of questions here may be targeted at how differences in personalities may affect the pilot's performance in the cockpit. A good starting point here is to talk about the issues of providing the synergy, or disrupting the synergy if these personalities don't get along, and creating a tense or challenging atmosphere, as opposed to a favorable work climate. The flight could be characterized by good crew interaction where synergies seem to flourish in the cockpit. Problems start when the captain's attitude is too authoritarian, or overconfident or domineering, or when the first officer in his or her turn lacks assertiveness. For example, the first officer was known to be reserved and non-assertive, and that he was subdued by the captain's strong personality. Alrighty, it seems like we've got ourselves another tangible portion of vocabulary. Let's take a break until next episode. Check out the website for more aviation English content, and don't forget to share the video with good fellas. Thanks for 10 minutes of your precious time. I hope that was worth it. And looking forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.